It was a beautiful day when I bombed the Pentagon. The sky was blue, the birds were singing, and finally all of those people were going to get what was coming to them. Those words were not spoken by Osama bin Laden. By the way, I changed one of the words to protect the pulpit. Those words were not spoken by Osama bin Laden. They're not spoken by any Muslim terrorist. They're spoken by this man, Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers, May 1972, bombed the Pentagon. He was a part of what is called the Weather Underground. The Weather Underground was a violent spin-off from another violent organization called Students for Democratic Society. It was a communist organization organized around student groups on campuses and universities across America. The Weather Underground was a violent spin-off from that as well. Bill Ayers and his wife Bernadine Dorn, who are pictured here, are both self-described communists. He's had his picture taken standing upon the crumpled American flag. He hates America. He hated America then. He hates America today. He was, and his wife was, actually, on the top 10 most wanted list of the FBI. Finally, after all the bombings and murders that they committed, the killings, they killed different individuals in different places, finally being on the run, they turned themselves in December 1980. It looked like they would be, of course, incarcerated for their lifetime or even face the death sentence. But something amazing happened. It's shocking to Americans. They were absolutely released free. And he made the statement, free as a bird, or guilty of sin, but free as a bird. What happened? What happened? How was it that we have one of the number one terrorists, homeborn terrorists, grew up in a middle-class family in the Midwest, and now a communist, his wife a communist, part of Marxist organizations? How is it that they are now turning themselves in for all the murders and the destruction of federal buildings they have committed, and yet they are released free to go? How did that happen? We'll save that for just a few more moments. I want to turn your attention right now to a book that has been published last year, 2023. The author's name is Christopher Rufo. Rufo writes in his book, America's Cultural Revolution, how the radical left has conquered everything. In the frontispiece of his book, he tells us that the radical left, and he means Marxists, have conquered not only the halls of academia, where Marxist professors now sit ensconced at Ivy League colleges and even colleges in North Texas as well, Marxist professorships. They have conquered all the halls of government, for many of them identify with Marxism today and the Marxist ideals. Marxism has conquered the mainstream media, big tech, all conquered. How Marxism has conquered, or radical left has conquered everything, and it's been going on for about 100 years. How did that happen? Christopher Rufo tells the story in his well-documented book published last year. For right now, I want to back up and make one notation regarding Marxism. We're looking at Marxism, which is really an anti-God. It's not simply a philosophy regarding with politics. It is an anti-God. I started to say atheist, but it is really anti-God. Marx shook his fist in God's face. It's an anti-God, anti-theistic philosophy, ideal concept that is based upon atheistic concepts, and it calls for the violent revolution or the violent overturning of all Western civilization. So the Students for Democratic Society took their marching orders from Marxism. What was the last line in the Communist Manifesto, where Marx called for the forcible overthrow of all existing institutions? So the Weather Underground was also part of it, but Marxism has changed its colors just a little bit, not the basic philosophical principles upon which it is based. Karl Marx talked about society being divided into the proletariat, that is the workers on the bottom level, the bourgeois on the top, and that is the landowners. And he says that we have this class warfare that's always going on, and its atheism is the key concept to all of it. But in the 1960s, in the American law schools, they changed the concepts of Marxism not to have class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeois, but between white and black, and to create chaos on a racial struggle in America. And that's exactly what is taking place today. And so it is called neo-Marxism. And what we're going to see is how neo-Marxism, this anti-God philosophy, has indeed conquered everything, but we'll only notice three areas very quickly and briefly. Number one, the government, taking over all of the halls of government. Number two, education. And then finally, number three, the streets and communities of our cities. And it is a very fearful prospect that we face in the future if America does not change its course. So let's look at, first of all, the government. We want to begin with this. John Winthrop, one of the first governors of Massachusetts Bay Colony, wrote in 1630, he spoke about America, at least that time, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, before America was actually formed. He said that we are like a city set on a hill. He derived that wording, of course, from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14, where our Lord tells us that we need to be like a city on a hill and shine our light, and we don't put the light under a bushel, but be like a city set on a hill. That's exactly what Winthrop had in mind, because we have a Christian community, a Christian colony here. He did not mean that the Christian or the colony was Christian in the sense that it was a theocratic colony that is ruled by priests or preachers, or that there was a joining together of church and state. He did not mean anything like that at all, nor did he mean that it would be a colony in which people paid with their tax money the priest to teach a particular doctrine. But it was simply a Christian colony in the sense that the people identified with Christianity and the principles of Christianity are embedded into the workings of our colony and the constitution of the colony. Exactly so regarding America. America was founded as, and our founding fathers put it bluntly and succinctly, frequently, almost uniformly, that America is a Christian nation, founded as a Christian nation. Once again, for emphasis' sake, they did not mean that it would be a theocratic nation, that is, ruled by priests, ruled by preachers, ruled by those aspects, nor did they mean that there would be a joining together of church and state in the sense that there would be an established church paid for, that is, the preachers of certain churches, paid for by tax money levied off the colonies or the communities. No, they didn't mean anything like that. What they meant was that the people identified as Christian, 95% of the colonists as America was founded, identified as Christian, Protestant Christian. That's how they identified themselves. 95%. And they meant that the principles of the Bible are embedded into our constitutional republic and the way that we do law and the way that we treat one another in our communities. That's the only thing they meant by it. And so frequently they all referred to it as a Christian nation. Benjamin Morris, for example, who was a second-generation American, gathered together so many state papers and documents and put together a large book in which he pointed out the Christian nature of our civil institutions and our societies. Our civil government is founded upon principles of Christianity, principles that come right out of the Bible. Principles such as Exodus chapter 18, which we mentioned in Bible class, and our law system that is a top-down, not a top-down control, but a bottom-up control system. That is, on the bottom, going all the way up from the municipal courts, local courts, county courts, then the state courts, and then finally the Supreme Court. Everything going all the way up. And that's how our country was founded. And they referred to Exodus 18 in so founding our nation. They referred to it, therefore, as a Christian nation. Many people are unaware of the fact that Thomas Jefferson even wanted our great seal not to have the eagle on it, but he wanted a picture of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt through the Red Sea. That's what he wanted to be, the great seal of the United States. Because they recognized this, they thought of it as a Christian nation. considering this Roger Sherman, who signed not only the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, wrote to his friend Samuel Baldwin, 1790, he says his faith is in the new republic. Notice he didn't call it a democracy. Was largely because he felt that it was founded upon Christianity as he understood it. The Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, in the early days, the Supreme Court of States was the final place of adjudication. They stated Christianity is and has always been a part of the common law of our country. That's why marriage was recognized between a man and a woman. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, a man shall leave his father and mother, cleave unto his wife. The two shall become one flesh. That was not necessarily encoded into the law, but that was the common law of the people. That we recognize that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that would be for life. Supreme Court in the Vidal case in 1844 said, it is unnecessary for us, and I want you to watch the wording here. This might be a shock to people how he states it, or how the Supreme Court words it. It is unnecessary for us to consider the establishment of a school for college or for the propagation of Judaism or deism or any other form of infidelity. Well, you couldn't say that today. If you say that today, you're going to bring a firestorm on your head. How do they consider that to be? Because Christianity, the belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, is the founding pillar, one of the founding pillars of our nation. That's why. And Judaism is indeed a system of infidelity, and they called it that way because they were unafraid to speak that way. So it's a system of Judaism, deism, or any other form of infidelity. Such a case is not to be presumed to exist in a Christian country. Supreme Court, 1844. The Supreme Court of 1892 said this, this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation. The case of the Holy Trinity actually listed in a great litany of cases and examples from history how in the world we can think that way. And you go back and look at American history, and that's exactly what they did. They listed all of the precepts, all of the laws, all of the customs, common laws that we understood from a biblical origin. And they said, this is a Christian nation. It always has been. Joseph Story, who was on the early Supreme Court, tells us this and wrote commentaries on the law, said probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, and he was there, he knew, and of the amendment to it now under consideration, the general, if not the universal sentiment was Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state, so far as was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and freedom of religious worship. In other words, we're not going to force people to attend worship services. An attempt to level all religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they would put Catholicism in that too. Any attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation. That means disapproval, if not universal indignation. But that's exactly where we are today. Remarkable how Supreme Court justices spoke in that day. Notice these three men, all of them framers of our Constitution. Noah Webster says the source of our Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. John Adams tells us it was founded upon the Christian religion. I like Patrick Henry's statement. Patrick Henry refused to sign the Constitution because he felt like we would wander too quickly, too off the beam. But he said he appreciated the Constitution and the founding of a country because he felt like it was founded upon the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now that sounds very strange. All of these things sound very strange in the ears of modern day America, because we have not only forgotten, but the modern methodology is to purposely forget what the founding of our country was all about. And they went to the Bible to establish all of these principles upon which our country rests. But things began to change, and they changed rapidly from the 1890s forward. We had a president, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, who was of the progressive school, he was actually a lecturer and a professor at Princeton, and he himself was a progressive, and that's simply a kind word for socialist. He was a socialist. That's all he was. Woodrow Wilson, when he would quote the Declaration of Independence, would leave out God. He would say, we are endowed by, and he would say by anybody, he'd say, we are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And frequently he would quote the Declaration and leave out under God or by God endowed, because he didn't believe that. And we took a radical different direction from the time of Woodrow Wilson. People think this is going on in the last few years. No, they've laid the groundwork for a long, long period of time. Then we come to FDR's period, in which he also did exactly the same thing, except he put it on steroids. As a matter of fact, when he wanted his New Deal programs to be passed in America, all 9 Supreme Court justices said they're unconstitutional under our form of government. Can't be done. But he played hardball politics. He was able to radically reform the Supreme Court, and so they pushed in the New Deal programs, and we put everything at a federal level. And since those days, we have never been the same. LBJ once again put it on more steroids with his Great Society in the 1960s, and so by the 1960s, we had turned solidly into socialism. As a matter of fact, the federal budget today, majority of it is socialistic programs. That's what's going on. Now, all of that to introduce you to this man right here. This man is, as you can see, his name is Edward Levi. Who is Edward Levi? Edward Levi was a member of an organization established in 1936 called the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild was at that time and still is a communist front organization. It was established by Communist International. It was established in the United States in order to get lawyers to favor communism in the United States. They were surveilled by the FBI. They were surveilled by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or at least recognized as a communist organization. Edward Levi was a member of the National Lawyers Guild. It still exists today. It's part of an international organization that is communistic in orientation also. What is remarkable here is that Edward Levi dropped his membership there, but later became the Attorney General of the United States. In the Ford administration in the 1970s, he became the Attorney General. What was going on in the 1970s? Well, in the 1970s, Bill Ayers was still setting bombs. And when he finally surrendered to the FBI in 1980, Edward Levi had set up in 1976 what were called the Levi Guidelines. The Levi Guidelines actually gutted the FBI's investigation of un-American activities. Nowadays, they knock on doors of people who are protesting abortion. That's what they do today. And you've seen that on television. He gutted the un-American activities investigation that the FBI was doing. And instead of having Bill Ayers and Bernardine prosecuted because of the Levi Guidelines, they were then set free. So Bill Ayers, a communist, Edward Levi, a member of the National Lawyers Guild, which was a communist organization. Now you can see how the pieces fit together. That's why he was released. That's why Ayers was released. Instead, Levi prosecuted the FBI agents who were actually tracking Ayers and Dorn. He prosecuted them instead. And that's what happened to the FBI. That was in the 1970s when I was in high school. Gerald Ford's AG right there. But at the same time, there was fomenting across the sea in Frankfurt, Germany, established in the 1920s, what was called the Frankfurt School. Now, the leaders of it were all Marxists. They wanted to call it the Marxist School, but they thought the name would be too provocative, so they called it the Frankfurt School. Consequently, the Frankfurt School began to pump out people who were Marxist, but the main goal, America. And they exported Marxism to the United States, and it came into our system here, infected by the 1920s and 30s, and finally, in the 1960s, they came up with the critical race theory. What is the critical race theory? Well, critical theory is how it began. Critical is a mild word, but it means the overthrow of all existing Western institutions. And in the words of Karl Marx, the forcible overthrow of all existing institutions. Now you know why there was so much violence on the streets in the 1960s. They were not simply people getting high and listening to rock and roll. They were people who were actually motivated by people who are Marxist at the bottom level and at the top level, and that's exactly what was going on. In the 1960s, the law schools took critical theory, the overturning of all Western institutions, and added race to it, so now it became the critical race theory. To give you an idea of it, they have as their teaching program called DEI, which is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. What is diversity, equity, and inclusion? It is from the top down, government mandating diversity, that is, of different races in workplaces and so forth. But I want you to notice the word equity. That's kind of a different word. We don't think about equity. We think something is equitable. We think about equality. But equity, what is equity? Equity is defined as the different treatment of individuals by the government in order to receive racial parity. The different treatment of individuals at laws, particularly by the government, of different races in order to receive racial parity. What has happened to the system of justice that we used to know? We used to rely upon passages such as those from Proverbs or such as Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 16, that a judge is to consider the case before him, and he was commanded in Deuteronomy 18:15 not to favor the rich man, not to favor the poor man, but to judge justly, rightly, every case. We have thrown that out the window. Now, when Joe Biden became president, he ordered that every office of government be thoroughly trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Every government office, our government has thoroughly been imbued. It's communism, Marxism. And that's what's happened with our government. Let's think about education for a moment. Our education took its cue from the Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, the passage that was read in your hearing a moment ago. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all of thy heart, with all of thy soul, with all of thy mind, with all of thy strength. These words which I command thee this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently unto your children, when you sit in the house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. You shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be for frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. Moses did not intend for that, obviously, to be taken in a fashion where many Jews today have a pouch on their forehead or on the right arm in which they have a passage of Scripture enwrapped. He meant all the time imbue yourself and your children with indoctrination into God's Word. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 tells us very plainly, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Note carefully what Solomon had to say is the beginning point of any educational endeavor. The fear of the Lord, respect for God. If there is not respect for God, there's not respect for the family, there's not respect for the law, there's not respect for the military, there's not respect for the police, there's not respect for governmental officials. The very first and foremost educational attainment is to instill in young people a respect for authority. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. What has happened to our educational system is explained by the absence of Proverbs 1 and 7 in our educational endeavors. But in the early days of America, this is exactly how it was. The Northwest Ordinance, for example, of 1787, same year the Constitution was signed, mandated, not simply suggested, mandated that in the Northwest Territories, which would be the territory of Ohio at this particular point, mandated that in public schools, Private schools? No, public schools. That religion, morality, and knowledge be taught. And they put it in that order. Why? Because of Proverbs 1 and 7. Religion, morality, and knowledge, then knowledge. Mandated that that be taught. And through the 1940s, we had vestiges of that in our public education system. I have a book in my library. It's a small book that was used in the 1940s by the Dallas public school system. Let me tell you something. It reads like a difficult curriculum, more difficult, more challenging than we have even in adult Bible classes today. Challenging curriculum regarding the Gospel of John or other New Testament books. That's the way it was done. But things were already beginning to radically change. And in the 1960s, we cast the Bible out. We cast prayer out. We cast all the Americana things out, basically out of the classrooms. We cast out morality. We cast out the teaching of biblical morality. We cast it out. And what immediately happened? We had immorality taken off and it skyrockets on a graph. That's what's happened to our public education system. I want to tell you the epilogue of one of the stories that we began earlier. Bill Ayers. Edward Levi let Bill Ayers out of prison, that is by his Levi guidelines. This is Bill Ayers, his wife Bernadine Dorn, just a few years ago. Guilty as sin, but free as a bird, because we had communists ensconced in positions of high power. He let them go. Bill Ayers went to the University of Illinois in Chicago. He got an education degree. Bernadine Dorn attended the University of Chicago Law School. Bill Ayers today writes textbooks that are used in our public classrooms right now in the state of Texas. He writes the curriculum for us. Bernadine Dorn got a law degree, and she fathered, or mothered, I should say, she sponsored the idea of social justice in the prison systems, juvenile detention, and so forth, telling us that we need to have racial parity, that is equalness of races, in juvenile detention and other places. And today, in Wichita Falls school system, we're teaching restorative justice. That comes from Bernadine Dorn. Now you know her roots, where they come from. Now it's how it's happened. I read an article just the other day. Her name is Maya Phillips, and it was written in this paper called the Epic Times. Maya Phillips is right now on the school board in San Diego County, California. She said, I have looked at the liberated ethnic studies curriculum. She says, I grew up in the Soviet Union. I escaped communism many years ago, and I came to America, the land of the free. But she said, I'm telling you, the ethnic studies curriculum in California, at least the ones I looked at, and you can bet your bottom dollar it's everywhere, she says it is nothing but communism, Marxism taught in the public school system. You have the same thing as class and race struggle. You have America condemned as a colonial system. You have all of the same talking points as I was taught in the Soviet Union under communistic rule. And it's going on right now in the state of California. What happened to our educational system is we've lost track of it and we lost hold of it. So many people today, Christian people, who concerned citizens, put their children in private schools because that's the kind of thing that's being taught in the public school system. Let's turn attention to the streets and community for just a moment. John Adams made a famous statement. You're probably familiar with it. He said, our Constitution is made only for a moral and religious people. It is not suitable to any other. Why did he say that? Because the Constitution, written on just a few pages, gives us just a few guidelines on how the federal government is to be run. But that relied upon the fact that people will infuse into their hearts what we read from Deuteronomy 6 and control our own lives by God's Word instilled here and control ourselves. But if we are going to remove God from society, remove biblical education from society, we're going to have chaos, not only in the schoolhouse, but chaos in the streets. And just as Maya Phillips said, in the Soviet Union and in Russia today, the average citizen is vindictive, he is godless, he is atheistic, they're all using one another. He said they are completely godless in their behavior, she said. That's exactly the kind of students that we are pushing out of the public system, and it now is hitting the streets in our communities. So John Adams said, if you're going to have that kind of country, our Constitution is not made for it, because people have to have guidance principles of God in their heart. And that's exactly what Deuteronomy 6 tells us. Write these things in your heart, and if we can't do that, then there's no constitutional system that will be able to control the chaos that ensues. That's what we're facing in our society. So, a few years ago, 2013 to be exact, Black Lives Matter was born. Black Lives Matter was started by 3 women of color, all claiming proudly to be lesbian. Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, Patricia Cullors. All 3 of them. All 3 of them were Marxist trained. By the way, they had Marxist training, some of them, in Los Angeles public school system. They went to Marxist academies in California. All of them were trained Marxists. Matter of fact, one of them was trained by Eric Mann. Who's Eric Mann? He was a member of the Weather Underground along with that man, Bill Ayers. He trained them. It's a Marxist organization. And on the front page of the website, as it opened up in 2013 and 2014, they had this, the abolition of the nuclear family. Where did they get that? Karl Marx. That's where. Abolition of the nuclear family. Destroy the nuclear family. Radical realignment of all power. Dismantle capitalism. That is freedom. Freedom in the marketplace, dismantle it. Now, they since scrubbed the website. They've gotten so much negative attention on the first line there, abolition of the nuclear family. They put that off of the website, but that was on the front page. I've seen it myself. But they've scrubbed all of that now and have on their board people that are Marxist, communist, and proud to say it. Now, that's what's happening in our nation. And yet, there's so many people who think it's all about black and white, and we need to be a part of it if we're a person of color. We need a part. No, this is a Marxist organization is what it is. I want to turn your attention to Psalms chapter 11 before we conclude. David has been pointed out, fingered by God, to be the next king of Israel. Saul knows it. David's in Saul's court. Saul knows it. The Spirit of God leaves Saul. He tries to kill David upon more than one occasion. David finally has to flee. And when David flees, he goes from one mountaintop to another cave, then into the Judean desert, down into the Shephelah, across the river, hiding continually. And what's happening? What has happened? Saul, who is the king of Israel, should be, of course, adjudicating the cases that come before him or the courts, and interested in foreign enemies. He has left all to chase David because of intense jealousy against David. He takes an armed band and chases David all through the mountains. And David writes Psalms 11. And here's what he says. Verse 2, he says, they tell me, flee as a bird to your mountain. And then finally, verse 3, the one I want to think about. He says, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? What did he mean, the foundations? That means the foundations of law and justice, the foundation of a godly education, the foundation of peace in our streets and peace in the home, the foundation of a family that can live at peace in a community, the family that can live at peace because the borders are protected. He means the foundations of society that the government should be taking care of, but instead the government is after the good guys, David, and he said the foundations are destroyed. If these foundations are destroyed, what is the righteous to do? What recourse are you going to have? Well, the same recourse David had. He had to go hide in caves. He had to hide in the mountains. He had to hide here and there in order to worship God acceptably because he was a wanted man because of one thing, Saul's jealousy. Saul turned justice upside down, and that is what social justice does. It turns justice upside down. That's what we're facing in this country. That's what's happening right now as we face an election season. That's why Christian people need to be engaged in what's occurring. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? You can ask Christians who are in other countries, what do? They hide for their lives. If they worship God, if you worship, for example, in Saudi Arabia, if you want to be a Christian, no go. No, you're going to have to hide. If you're going to worship in different African countries, you're going to be, once again, hiding for your life because they disallow it. You're not going to own property. Abolition of private property has already occurred in many countries. South Africa, they're already confiscating the properties and farms of the white majority people that used to be in the majority. Confiscating them, murdering the people right now. Right now as we speak. That's going on. That's what we mean when, and that's what David means. If the foundations are destroyed, what are the righteous to do? We need to have a country that is solidly behind God and people who are persuaded that God is our only answer, and that is He to whom we must pray and we must petition continually in this difficult season. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? The lesson is yours if you want to respond. Right now we sing the invitation song. It's simply an opportunity that if you come to the front, by faith, repentance, baptism into Christ, then God puts you into His family. That's a moment of rejoicing. Come right now while we stand and sing if you're subject to the invitation.